privilege to be with all of you, and I feel right at home here, judging that all the front rows are empty. I take it you're Catholic. You know, the Eucharist is, in Spanish we say acción de gracias, so it's a communion, a comunión, and in the end we're invited to somehow stand in kinship with each other and bridge the distance. As the bishop said earlier, that there is no us and them, there's just us. So for almost 40 years I've been working with gang members. It's the privilege of my life, and the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands and thousands of men and women I've been privileged to know. The other day in front of my office there was a homie named Johnny, and I've known him for a lot of years, covered in tattoos. He used to work in our Homeboy bakery. Now he's a chef in his own right, and I hadn't seen him for like 2 years of the pandemic, so he gave me a big abrazo in front of our headquarters in Chinatown in Los Angeles. And after he hugged me, he stood back and he was kind of, I don't know, scoping me out. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, you look different." And I said, "Well, I have lost 30 pounds. And he said, "Huh, I didn't know hair weighed that much." And suddenly, kinship so quickly, connection. There is no daylight that separates us. Separation is an illusion. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we together, as a Eucharistic community, seek to dismantle the barriers that exclude so that we have communion? How do we create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it? And so we stand out at the margins, because that's the only way they'll get erased. And we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while, what a privilege, as was just expressed by the deacon, what a privilege to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. We get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so we brace ourselves as we stand at the margins, because the world will accuse all of us of wasting our time there. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." How do we go to the margins and these other voices get heard? Well, none of that makes any sense, of course, except were it not for our notion of a God that is spacious and expansive. Meister Eckhart, who was a theologian and a mystic, said that it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And somehow we want to, as St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, says, to find the God who's always greater. Sometimes our God can be too puny and too small. It's true enough that we are created in the image and likeness of God, but it's equally true that our image of God creates us. My friend Annie Lamott, who's a writer, says, "You know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do." So you want to avoid that at all costs. So I've been working with gang members for 40 years, and I say Mass on a rotating basis in 25 different detention facilities. And And there I was in a San Fernando juvenile hall, and there are 500 kids there, mainly gang members, all on folding chairs in a gym. And I'm up on a tiny little raised platform, and I'm vested wearing my alb and my stole. And I'm sitting in my chair, and one by one, the homies will come up and do the readings on that Sunday. And so they have these sheets that have the readings in English and Spanish. And I close my eyes, and I'm listening to the Word of God being proclaimed by these guys. And first one got up and did the Old Testament reading, and the second guy got up and did the responsorial psalm. And I don't know, there was a kind of a overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I looked at the sheet, what the hell? And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because the exalted God, if we're honest, is the creation of human beings. If I was God, I would want to be exalted. But the exhausted God, you can connect to it. If you have kids or your grandkids, hey, how was your weekend? Oh my God, I'm exhausted, I'm pooped. The grandkids were over, but you know what it is. It's about an extensiveness that isn't needy, that is focused in the other. It's a love that never stops loving. We get what it is. It's spacious and it's expansive. And we want to be in the world who our God is. We want to be that open-hearted in our love. And so we receive the tender glance from the God who loves us without measure and without regret. And then we choose to be that tender glance in the world. I'm a Jesuit, like the Pope, and the Homies, which is the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So we get 15,000 folks a year walking through there. And there are 120,000 gang members in LA County and 1,100 gangs. So every gang member in LA County knows where we are and what we do. And the place is just filled with gang members who are getting tattoos removed or working in one of our 10 social enterprises or doing therapy or part of our 18-month training program. The list is long of services. But they don't really know what a Jesuit is. I mean, there's like 3 of us who work there, but they don't really get it exactly. And so we have like 6 or so tours a day from groups all over the world. And the other day I was sitting in my office, and it's glass enclosed so I can see the tour group that comes in, and Osvaldo is giving the tour. And it's like 20 people, and they just park right in front of my glass enclosed office, and I have like 3 people there, and I wave faintly, and it's one of those observe our founder in his natural habitat kind of moments. And I can hear Osvaldo because he has a very loud voice, and he says, "This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So I'm doing all my best moves, But I was reading the other day that St. Ignatius of Loyola on February 27th, 1544, writes this word for the very first time. And then he proceeds to use this word a lot in his spiritual journal, where he writes this word for the first time. And he writes this word a lot until he dies 12 years later. And he goes back to the word and he circles the word. And I speak Spanish, but I'd never heard this word before. And the word is acatamiento, acatamiento. And it comes from the word acatar, to look at something with attention. And it was part of a mystical moment between St. Ignatius and the God he knew. But he didn't settle for a moment. He insisted that it become a movement, a stance in the world. I'm not talking about the Jesuits. I'm talking about a spiritual stance in the world to receive the tender glance, and then to choose to be that tender glance in our world. Acatamiento, to look at something with attention. It gets translated as affectionate awe, and that is the role of the Christian in the world, to stand with tenderness and affectionate awe. It reminds me of in the Acts of the Apostles, it has this one line and it says, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. At Homeboy Industries, folks come into our offices and they are, every single one comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Every single one comes to Homeboy Industries barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. You receive the tender glance and you return it. At Homeboy Industries, we are allergic to the notion of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up, mainly because our exhausted God never does that to us. Instead, we hold the mirror up and tell people the truth, that they are exactly what God had in mind when God made them, and then they become that truth, and then they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. Homeboy Industries was started in 1988 when I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city that had 8 gangs at war with each other, and the LAPD deemed my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity anywhere. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 255th, a young man named Jacob, just 3 weeks ago. They're not all from that parish, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked to do this. So we did a lot of things, and we started a school and a jobs program, and now we're quite large. But mainly, we want to create a place that's safe, where gang members can be seen and then cherished, that they can have a palpable experience of the tenderness of God. For it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. The Buddhists say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." The homies say, "We're used to being watched, we're not used to being seen." And the only thing that can address their shame is the tender glance, and human beings willing to communicate it. You don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks there will make you different. You don't go to the margins to reach people. You go to the margins to be reached. I remember a number of years ago, I got an invitation to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was what we call in the biz a gang in-service. And so, these social workers commandeer a hotel ballroom from 9 to 5, and they get credits and sign in, and their keynote speeches and workshops and breakout things. And I'd done a lot of these, and I said yes, figuring I'd give a keynote, and so I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pull out the original letter inviting me, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day, you know, and I said to myself what the homies often say, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. And so I invited two of our trainees, two gang members from rival enemy gangs, Andre and Jose, and they're in our 18-month training program, but they're like in their 9th month. And so I sit them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he's like 25 years old at the time, covered in tattoos, been to prison, a shot caller from his gang. At this juncture in his 18 months with us, like our 9th month, he had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only had he been to prison and a gang member, he had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say that my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And I've never seen it happen. They went from gasp to laugh. We got whiplash. And then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage and she knocks on the door, and a guy comes to the door and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. The Christmas carol says, "Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." And yeah, it's a song about Jesus, and yeah, it's about Christmas. But how is it not the job description of every one of you? You appear at the margins, and the soul feels its worth. You receive the tender glance, and then you extend that tender glance, acknowledging that love never stops loving, and acknowledging your true selves in love. What Martin Luther King says about church could well be said of your time here today, that it's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to create a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. We could well ask ourselves, what kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? And let me close with this. It occurs sometimes to universities to force their students to read my books against their will, and I'm not complaining, but my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, that ruins my brackets every year, invited me because they had assigned the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. So they had a big venue, 1,000 people, on a Tuesday night, and they said, could you bring 2 homies? And I always bring homies if they ask and are gonna pay for it. And I said, well, you know, I always pick 2 homies who are enemies from rival gangs so they have to share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. And so I picked Larry, an African-American gang member, and Mario. And homies are always nervous when they fly, but I've never had anybody quite like this guy Mario. It was starting to freak me out. He was hyperventilating. He was so terrified. And we hadn't even, boarded the plane yet. And so we're at Burbank Airport, which is kind of a smallish airport, but big planes, Southwest Airlines, and they don't have that hermetically sealed chute to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to go to the front of the plane and the steps to go to the back of the plane, which is the big feature there. And it's early morning, and it's the first flight of the day, and Mario's sitting next to me, and Larry's exploring the airport. And our flight crew arrives, and I see these 2 flight attendants, females, with very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps to board the plane. And Mario goes, when are we gonna board the plane? And I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said this. So I should tell you that in our history, 34 years as an organization, Mario is the most tattooed individual who has ever worked there, which is really saying something. And he's all sleeved out, tattoos to his fingers, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that, when he's in his coffin, there will be no doubt to anybody. And so I'd never been in public with him, and so I'm trying to calm him down, and I'm walking him through the airport, and people are like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. I'm going, oh, wow, it's because of the tattoos. But if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday and walk up to anybody and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul here? They'd all say Mario. Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's the big talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is they have like 94 classes that they want you to visit, and I thought, oh my gosh. So I told these two guys, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. You get up and speak, because I'm going to mainly speak tonight. And so they did, and they were terrified, especially Mario was petrified, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So the nighttime venue comes, and I coax the two of them to start, and each do a 7-minute kind of Polaroid snapshot of their lives, much as they had done in the classroom, so that after my 40 minutes, I could invite them up to be part of the question and answer. So they did it, and Mario in particular was quite terrified, but they did a good job. So I get up after them and I do my thing, and then I invite them to stand on either side of me, and I said, yes, questions. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario comes up to the microphone. He's a kind of a tall, skinny drink of water, and he's clutching the microphone. He's trembling, and yes, and he's terrified. And she says, well, you say, Mario, that you're a father, and you have a sister and a daughter, a daughter and a son who are about to enter, their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone, and I can sense that he's trembling even more, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's gonna say. And when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says these two words, he rushes back to his microphone clutching refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears, but he wants to get this sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. But they had been returned to themselves. And the soul feels its worth. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. This Eucharistic Congress is not the place you've come to. It was always going to be the place you would go from, and you go from here to be the tender glance, to stand at the margins with acatamiento, with affectionate awe, to allow your hearts to be altered by the widow, orphan, and the stranger. Those are the ones God has identified as knowing what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered in exactly this way, God thinks these happen to be our trustworthy guides to lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. And so you go to the margins to create such a community, a communion, such that God might recognize it. And pretty soon you cease to care whether anyone accuses you of wasting your time there. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.